We welcome you back to this channel. Today we will explore paranormal experiences on haunted roads. Three friends face wails and shadows that threaten their lives. A journalist investigates a ghost child, and a bridge where the spirit of an unjustly executed monk is encountered. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown.
Midnight Wails.
It was a cold and clear night when we decided to embark on our adventure. We were three: John, Emily, and me, Daniel. For some time we had heard stories about the Road of Laments, a forgotten stretch in the mountains, shrouded in mystery and terror. It was said that at nightfall, the wails of lost souls echoed throughout the road. The idea of spending the night there seemed like the perfect test of courage we were looking for. We arrived at dusk. The road was covered in weeds and trees that leaned over the asphalt as if trying to catch us. We parked the car on the side of the path and got out with flashlights and backpacks full of supplies. The atmosphere was heavy, the silence only interrupted by the crunching of our steps on dry leaves. The moon barely lit the place, creating long, sinister shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. We set up a small camp near a sharp curve. The light from our flashlights cast eerie shadows on the trees. Everything seemed calm, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. As the darkness deepened, the air seemed to grow colder, and a light mist began to cover the ground, giving the place an even more ghostly appearance. Around 10, Emily was the first to hear them. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. We fell silent, holding our breath. Then we heard it, a prolonged wail, like a whisper fading into the night. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. John tried to laugh to lighten the mood, but his laughter sounded forced and hollow. Emily hugged herself, trying to contain the growing fear inside her. We decided to move a little closer to the road, leaving the camp behind. We walked in a line, flashlights pointed ahead, though the darkness seemed to absorb the light. As we advanced, the wails grew louder, closer. The sound seemed to form indistinguishable words, as if the souls were trying to communicate with us. Suddenly, Emily screamed. We turned to see her pointing towards a spot in the darkness. There, among the trees, we glimpsed a tall, thin figure. It seemed wrapped in shadows, its face an indistinct blur. Before we could react, the figure vanished as if it had never been there. Fear began to take hold of us, but we tried to stay calm. "We need to go back," John said, but the way back seemed to have disappeared. The trees had closed in around us, and the road stretched endlessly in both directions. I felt a tightness in my chest, a sense that something malevolent had trapped us in its web. We continued forward, hoping to find some sign of our camp. The wails were now deafening, mixed with murmurs that seemed to rise from the ground itself. I felt the eyes of something invisible following us, and my skin prickled with each step. The shadows around us seemed to move unnaturally, as if they were alive. Suddenly, Emily fell to her knees, crying and screaming. We tried to lift her, but something was holding her down. It was as if invisible hands were grabbing her. Out of the darkness emerged more figures, all with human forms but wrapped in impenetrable shadows. Their eyes, if they had any, were black voids. John tried to run, but one of the entities caught him, dragging him into the darkness. His screams quickly faded, leaving only a terrifying echo. I tried to fight. I screamed. I hit the air, but it was useless. The shadows enveloped us, and I felt an intense cold, as if the very air was being ripped from my lungs. The shadows closed in on us, whispering and wailing around us. Then one of the figures spoke, its voice a chilling whisper. "This is our domain. No one escapes." Its words resonated in my mind, and I understood that we were lost. The darkness closed completely over us, and the wails became our only companion. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. I was alone, in the middle of the road. The car, the camp, my friends, everything had disappeared. The wails still echoed in the distance, reminding me that the Road of Laments does not forgive those who dare to challenge it. I managed to get out of there, but I have not seen my friends again. Every night as I close my eyes, I see them, trapped in the darkness, calling me with distorted voices. And I know that someday, those shadows will come for me too.
Disappearance on the road.
I've been a journalist for more than 10 years, and few things have surprised me as much as what I discovered on the rural road near my town. It all started with a rumor that reached the newsroom. Several drivers claimed to have seen a small child walking alone at night on a dark and desolate stretch of the road. The news, although it seemed like just another urban legend, caught my attention. I decided to investigate personally, intrigued by the possibility of uncovering the truth behind these stories. I began interviewing some of the witnesses. They all described the child in the same way. No more than 6 years old, dressed in a white shirt and shorts, barefoot with a lost expression on his face. His eyes, according to some, shone with a strange glow in the dim light. Most drivers, upon seeing him, stopped with the intention of helping, but as they approached, the child simply disappeared. That was strange enough to deserve my attention. I decided to travel the road at night, armed with my recorder, a camera, and a flashlight. The road was a winding stretch, surrounded by tall trees forming a natural tunnel. As night fell, the atmosphere became more unsettling, with the moon barely illuminating the asphalt and the sound of crickets echoing in the darkness. It was around 2 a.m. when I saw him. Right at a sharp curve, there was the child, exactly as described. Small, barefoot, and wearing a white shirt that seemed to faintly glow under the moonlight. I slowed down and stopped a few meters from him. I got out of the car feeling a chill run down my spine. "Hello," I called, trying not to scare him. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The child did not respond. He just looked at me with those empty, shining eyes. I took a step toward him, and that's when I noticed. There was no trace of dust or mud on his bare feet, despite the dirt road. I felt something was wrong, but my journalistic instinct pushed me to continue. "Are you lost?" I asked, approaching a bit more. The child tilted his head, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Suddenly, he began to walk toward the forest, and without thinking, I followed him into the darkness. The flashlight barely illuminated the path, and every sound seemed amplified in the quiet of the night. "Wait!" I shouted, but the child didn't stop. His steps were light and quick, as if he were floating above the ground. I started to run, feeling adrenaline surge through me. Suddenly, the child stopped and turned to me. His expression changed from loss to something more sinister. A chill ran through my body when I heard his voice, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Come play with me," he said, and his voice echoed in my head like a terrifying echo. I was paralyzed, unable to move. The child extended his hand, and I could see that his skin was cold and translucent. At that moment, the flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in total darkness. Fear overwhelmed me, and I stumbled backward, falling to the ground. When the flashlight came back on, the child had disappeared. I ran back to the car, my heart pounding. I drove back to my town, trying to process what I had seen. The next day, I investigated in the local archives and discovered an old news article. More than 30 years ago, a child had disappeared on that same road. He was never found. I returned to the newsroom with the recording and the images, but none captured the essence of what I had experienced. The story was published, causing a stir, but I knew I had only scratched the surface of a much deeper and darker mystery. Since then, every time I drive on the road, I can't help but look into the darkness, hoping not to find those shining eyes and that whispering voice that still echoes in my nightmares. The child on the road is still there, waiting, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. And I, although no longer the same, continue to seek answers, knowing that some questions perhaps should never be answered.
The monk.
My name is Luke, and this story is something I experienced firsthand. It was a dark and stormy night when I ventured onto the road that crossed an old stone bridge. This bridge had gained notoriety for the strange apparitions reported in the area. Many said that at midnight, a hooded figure could be seen. The spirit of a monk unjustly executed centuries ago, seeking justice. I didn't believe in those stories, but that night, everything changed. The bridge was ancient, with stones worn down by time and weather, rising over a river that whispered stories of bygone eras. The atmosphere was dense, almost palpable, and the mist rising from the water seemed to form figures that vanished instantly. I decided to cross the bridge at midnight, out of a mixture of disbelief and a need to face my own demons. As I set foot on the bridge, a chill ran down my spine. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and the air grew heavy. I continued walking, trying to ignore the growing fear in my chest. Suddenly, a hooded figure appeared before me, its silhouette dark and its presence imposing. Its eyes, two voids, seemed to stare directly into my soul. "Who are you?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. The figure didn't respond with words, but raised a hand and pointed to the other end of the bridge. At that moment, a vision unfolded before my eyes. I saw a young monk, dressed in his habit, being dragged and chained, accused of crimes he hadn't committed. His face showed a mix of terror and resignation. He was executed without a fair trial, and his soul remained trapped, seeking vengeance against those who wronged him. The hooded monk began to advance toward me, his steps echoing on the bridge like the reverberation of his suffering. Each step felt like a weight on my shoulders, forcing me to confront my own sins and regrets. I remembered all the times I had hurt others, the broken promises, and the lies told. It was as if the monk could see through me and unearth every one of my wrongdoings. I tried to run, but my feet seemed glued to the ground. The monk extended his hand toward me, and I felt a cold that penetrated my bones and an indescribable despair. Somehow, I managed to mutter a prayer, asking for forgiveness and mercy. Suddenly, the monk stopped, and the shadows dissipated. I felt a strange calm and knew I had passed the test, but my relief was short-lived. In the distance, I heard the engine of a car approaching rapidly. It was the priest, Father Thomas, called to exorcise the bridge and free the trapped souls. Father Thomas arrived and began to pray aloud, blessing the place with holy water. But he soon realized that not all spirits wanted to be freed. Some souls, consumed by their hatred and resentment, preferred to stay, tormenting the living as a form of eternal vengeance. The hooded monk appeared before the priest, his figure imposing and his gaze piercing. Father Thomas tried to exorcise him, but the monk resisted. It was then that the priest understood the truth. The monk wasn't seeking justice but redemption. He needed someone to acknowledge his suffering and free him from his burden. Moved by the monk's story, Father Thomas changed his approach. Instead of trying to exorcise him, he began to pray for his soul, asking God to forgive him and let him rest in peace. The monk's figure slowly began to fade, whispering a barely audible thank you. When it was over, the bridge returned to calm. The trapped souls began to release, though some shadows persisted, reminders of those who still couldn't let go of their hatred. Father Thomas looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a mixture of relief and concern. Since that night, the bridge was never the same. The apparitions decreased, but the place never lost its air of mystery. As for me, I learned to face my own demons and seek redemption for my actions. That bridge remains a reminder that sometimes the worst condemnations don't come from the beyond, but from the darkest corners of our own hearts. And though many may have found peace, the echo of their suffering still resonates on stormy nights, reminding us that the past is never truly buried.
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.